The ballroom sparkled that night. Crystal chandeliers rained golden light across polished marble floors, and a string quartet played softly in the corner as waiters glided between tables with champagne flutes. It was the company's 15th anniversary, and no expense had been spared. Executives mingled in designer suits, their laughter bouncing off the high ceilings, each one eager to impress the woman at the center of it all, Veronica Langford, the CEO. Veronica stood near the stage, commanding attention the way she always did. Tall, striking, dressed in an emerald gown that shimmered under the lights, she was both admired and feared. With a glass of wine in hand, she moved from one group of board members to another, her words sharp, her humor edged. To her, the night was about power, reminding everyone who ran the empire. Across the room, unnoticed by most, a man pushed a cleaning cart. His dark uniform set him apart from the glittering crowd, his presence almost invisible. Samuel, the janitor, moved with quiet efficiency, sweeping up crumbs, wiping down a table, adjusting chairs no one cared about. He avoided eye contact, accustomed to being ignored. For him, nights like these were just another shift. But not for Veronica. She thrived in these moments. And when she caught sight of Samuel near the grand piano polishing the edge of its glossy lid, an idea, sharp and mocking, sparked in her mind. "Ladies and gentlemen," she called out, her voice slicing through the chatter. All eyes turned to her as she gestured toward the janitor. "Look at our hard-working friend here, keeping everything spotless while we celebrate." The crowd chuckled politely, some with a hint of cruelty in their smiles. Samuel froze, standing still beside the piano, not sure whether to bow his head or just keep working. Veronica tilted her glass, her lips curling into a smirk. "Tell me, Samuel, do you play?" She tapped the polished lid of the piano, the sound echoing in the hush. "If you can play Chopin, I'll marry you." The words hung in the air, dripping with sarcasm. Laughter erupted around the room, executives, investors, and managers shaking their heads at the absurdity. A janitor, play Chopin? The very idea was laughable. Samuel, however, did not flinch. He didn't laugh. He didn't shrink away. Instead, he looked at Veronica for a brief moment, his eyes calm, unreadable, and then simply gave a small, almost imperceptible nod before returning to his cart. The laughter carried on, but Veronica felt a strange flicker in her chest. It was just a joke, she told herself. A harmless jab. But something about his quiet, unshaken response unsettled her, though she quickly brushed it off, raising her glass again to toast with the others. Yet deep down, she didn't realize that her careless challenge had already set something in motion that would soon change both of their lives forever. The celebration stretched late into the night. By the time the last of the guests had left, the ballroom was a mess, empty glasses cluttered tables, napkins lay crumpled on the floor, and the once polished marble had smudges of spilled champagne. Veronica remained in her office upstairs, finishing her final glass of wine while flipping through congratulatory emails. The building had fallen quiet, save for the muffled sounds of the janitorial staff beginning their nightly work. Veronica liked the silence after such events. It reminded her of the solitude at the top, a reminder that no matter how many people surrounded her, she always stood alone. But then she heard it. At first, she thought it was a recording left on by the quartet, a faint melody drifting through the hallways. But no, this was different. Softer. Alive. The sound of a piano, each note clear and deliberate, rising and falling like a whispered conversation. The melody was unmistakable, even to someone who had only dabbled in classical music. Chopin. Curiosity stirred. Veronica set down her glass and stepped into the empty corridors, her heels clicking against the floor as she followed the sound. The closer she came to the ballroom, the stronger the music grew, until it enveloped her completely. She stopped in the doorway, her breath caught. There, beneath the glow of a single chandelier, Samuel sat at the grand piano. His janitor's jacket was folded neatly over the bench, and he leaned slightly forward, his hands gliding across the ivory keys as though they were an extension of himself. The music poured from him effortlessly, soulful and precise. His eyes were half closed, not in performance but in communion, as though he were speaking with someone only he could see. The room that had hours earlier roared with laughter was now transformed into a cathedral of sound. Every note seemed to cleanse the air of arrogance, replacing it with beauty that was raw and undeniable. Veronica gripped the doorframe, unable to step inside. The memory of her mocking words burned hot in her mind. "If you can play Chopin, I'll marry you." Yet here he was, not fumbling, not pretending, but mastering the very piece she had carelessly thrown at him. Samuel played as if the music had been waiting inside him all along, biding its time for this moment. His fingers danced with precision, each chord resonating with a depth that no professional performer she had ever heard could match. It wasn't just skill, it was soul. When the final notes faded, Samuel let his hands rest on the keys, his shoulders rising and falling with a quiet exhale. For a moment, the silence was heavier than the music had been. Veronica stepped forward before she even realized it, her voice breaking the spell. "Where," she began, her words softer than she intended, "where did you learn to play like that?" Samuel turned his head slowly. His face was calm, the same unreadable expression he had worn earlier, though now his eyes carried something deeper. Something that unsettled her more than the music itself. "I learned a long time ago," he said simply, before rising from the bench and slipping his jacket back on. His movements were unhurried, as if the performance had not been for her at all, but for himself. Veronica stood frozen, torn between disbelief and shame. For the first time in years, she had no witty remark, no cutting retort. Just silence, and a lingering melody that refused to leave her heart. Veronica couldn't sleep that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard it, the flowing, haunting notes of Chopin echoing through her mind. She had witnessed countless performances in concert halls, flown to Vienna and Paris for the best, but none of them had shaken her like the Janitor's quiet midnight recital. By morning, her curiosity had hardened into something more demanding. She needed to know who Samuel really was. She found him the next evening in the staff break room, a small, fluorescent-lit space where janitors kept their supplies and ate meals in silence. Samuel sat alone at the corner table, eating from a plain lunchbox. His posture was unassuming, his hands, those same hands that had created magic on the piano, rested calmly around a simple sandwich. Veronica stood in the doorway, arms crossed, unsure how to begin. The CEO of a multimillion-dollar company wasn't used to feeling nervous. But she forced herself forward. "Samuel," she said, her tone firm but softer than usual. "I want to know about last night." He glanced up, expression unreadable. "About what, ma'am?" "The piano," she pressed. "You didn't just learn a long time ago. That wasn't a hobbyist's playing. That was," she struggled for the right word. "Professional." For a long moment, Samuel said nothing. He set down his sandwich, folded his hands, and looked at her. Not with the fear or deference she was accustomed to, but with a quiet steadiness that made her shift uncomfortably. Finally, he spoke. "I studied at the Royal Conservatory of Music. On scholarship. I was supposed to tour Europe after graduation. Chopin, Beethoven, Liszt, you name it. Music was my entire life." Veronica blinked. She had expected a modest story, not something so grand. "And yet, you're here. Sweeping floors in my company." Samuel's gaze dropped to the table. "Life doesn't always play the notes we want." His voice was calm, but there was a heaviness beneath it. "My mother was sick. The kind of illness money drains away faster than water. My father was gone, and I was the only one left to care for her. The conservatory offered prestige, but prestige doesn't pay hospital bills." He paused, swallowing hard before continuing. "So I left. I took whatever jobs I could find. At night, I played in empty churches to keep from losing myself. And eventually. He gave a faint shrug. Eventually, even that stopped. Veronica found herself sitting opposite him without realizing she had moved. She studied him, this man who had lived two entirely different lives, one as a rising star in the world of music, the other as a forgotten janitor wiping away the traces of other people's celebrations. "You gave it all up?" she asked quietly. "I didn't give it up," Samuel corrected gently. "I traded it, for love. For duty. For family. I don't regret it." The words hit her harder than she expected. For someone who had built her empire on ambition, sacrifice meant clawing to the top, never letting go of anything. Yet here was a man who had given up the very dream others would kill for, and carried no bitterness in his voice. For the first time, Veronica felt the sting of her own arrogance. Her cruel joke the night before seemed shameful now, exposed against the dignity of his choices. But Samuel, sensing her silence, only picked up his sandwich again. "Don't trouble yourself over it, Miss Langford. Music was never about stages or audiences. It was about keeping my soul alive. And it still is." Veronica left the break room with her thoughts tangled, her heart unsteady. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like the most powerful person in the building. Days turned into weeks, but Veronica couldn't shake Samuel's story, or the music that lingered in her mind like a ghost. She had always thought of herself as untouchable, a woman who had climbed to the very top without relying on anyone, her ambition sharper than steel. Yet every time she passed Samuel in the corridors, she felt a strange pull, as though the world she had built on pride was no longer as solid as it seemed. One evening, long after most employees had gone home, Veronica found herself wandering through the lobby again. She told herself it was coincidence, but in truth she was listening, hoping. And then, like a secret meant only for her, she heard it. The faint strains of another Chopin piece floated through the dimly lit hall. She followed the sound, and there he was again. Samuel, sitting at the grand piano, playing as if time itself bent around him. This time, it wasn't just technical brilliance, it was tenderness. The notes wrapped around her like a confession, something she wasn't sure she deserved to hear. She didn't interrupt. Not at first. Instead, she sank into a chair near the back of the room, watching silently. For the first time in years, she let her shoulders drop, her breath slowing as the music filled the empty space inside her that no wealth or power had ever touched. When Samuel finished, he looked up and noticed her. There was no surprise in his expression, only quiet acknowledgement, as though he had expected her to come. "You don't play for the crowd," Veronica said softly, breaking the silence. "You play for yourself." Samuel gave a small nod. "For myself. For my mother. For anyone who listens with more than just their ears." Something inside Veronica cracked. She realized how long it had been since she had listened to anything. Or anyone, deeply. Her life was a blur of numbers, deals, and appearances. She couldn't remember the last time she had done something simply because it was beautiful. In the days that followed, she found excuses to linger in the building after hours. Sometimes she would ask Samuel about the composers he played, other times she would sit in silence, letting the music wash over her. Little by little, the walls she had built around herself began to soften. Her staff noticed a change too. The once sharp-tongued CEO was different. She wasn't suddenly kind, but there was a new patience in her voice, a gentleness that unsettled those used to her iron demeanor. She gave credit where she never used to. She paused before cutting someone down. She even began smiling, not the cold, calculated smile she used in boardrooms, but something warmer, almost unguarded. One night, as Samuel finished another nocturne, Veronica whispered, "I can't stop thinking about that night. The way I laughed at you. The way I mocked you." Samuel simply closed the lid of the piano, standing slowly. "It doesn't matter anymore." But to Veronica, it did. It mattered more than she wanted to admit. For the first time in her life, she longed not to be admired, or feared, or envied, but to be forgiven. And she knew, deep down, that Samuel was the only one who could teach her what that truly meant. The following month, the company prepared for its annual Winter Gala, an event that drew media, investors, and influential figures from across the city. For Veronica, it was usually just another chance to showcase her dominance, a night where all eyes were on her. But this year felt different. For the first time, she wasn't thinking about herself. She was thinking about him. The ballroom gleamed brighter than ever, crystal chandeliers scattering light like diamonds, velvet curtains framing the grand stage, and a towering ice sculpture that seemed to defy gravity at the center of the hall. Guests in tuxedos and gowns filled the space, their conversations buzzing with anticipation of the CEO's yearly speech. But as Veronica took the stage that night, she carried no speech cards. No carefully rehearsed words. Just a quiet determination that trembled in her chest. "Good evening," she began, her voice steady though her hands trembled behind the podium. "For 15 years, this company has celebrated success, wealth, and ambition. But tonight, I want to celebrate something else, something I almost forgot existed in this world." The audience shifted, intrigued. Veronica turned toward the gleaming grand piano at the edge of the stage. The spotlight followed her gaze. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying through the hushed hall, "I want to introduce you to someone you've all overlooked. A man who isn't just part of this company, he's part of its soul. Samuel." A murmur rippled through the crowd as Samuel, in his janitor's uniform, stepped hesitantly into the light. Guests exchanged puzzled looks, some even scoffed, but Veronica's eyes never left him. She gestured to the piano. "Would you honor us?" she asked softly. Samuel paused, then slowly nodded. Sitting at the bench, he placed his hands on the keys. The first notes of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major floated into the air, gentle, haunting, and breathtaking. The room transformed. Laughter and chatter dissolved into reverent silence as the music poured forth. Guests who had once dismissed him as invisible now sat spellbound, their expressions softening, eyes glistening. Each note seemed to strip away the vanity of the night, leaving only the raw beauty of sound and soul. Veronica stood at the edge of the stage, watching him. For the first time in her life, she felt small, but not in weakness. In humility. When the final chord faded, the hall erupted in applause. People rose to their feet, clapping with a fervor usually reserved for world-class performers. Samuel stood quietly, bowing his head, his modesty only deepening the awe. Then Veronica stepped forward. Her heart pounded as she faced the crowd. "A few weeks ago," she began, her voice catching, "I mocked this man. I made a cruel joke at his expense, one that revealed more about me than it did about him. I told him, if you can play Chopin, I'll marry you." Gasps spread across the hall. A few laughed nervously, assuming she was setting up another jest. But Veronica's voice trembled with sincerity. "Tonight, you've all heard the truth for yourselves. And I stand here to say, I wasn't joking. Samuel," she turned to him, her eyes shining. "If you'll still have me, the answer is yes." The entire ballroom froze. Investors, executives, waiters, all stared in stunned silence. For the first time in her reign as CEO, Veronica wasn't the woman holding power over the room. She was the one laying herself bare, risking ridicule, risking rejection. Samuel looked at her, his expression unreadable, his silence stretching like an eternity. Then, slowly, he stepped closer, his calm eyes softening with something unspoken. "You don't know what you're asking," he said quietly, only she could hear. "Yes, I do," Veronica whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm asking for a chance to be better. To live for something more than myself. To live, with you." For a long moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. And then, Samuel's lips curved into the faintest smile. He gave a small nod. The ballroom erupted, applause, cheers, disbelief, flashes of cameras, but Veronica didn't hear any of it. All she heard was the echo of Chopin in her chest, and the quiet promise in Samuel's eyes. For the first time in her life, she hadn't won something. She had been given it. And that made it priceless.